Okay. Well, I don't have more to add to your observation there, Bob. You know, those markings on the south side of Elm Street seem to have gone in the night before. Paint was still wet. People had stepped in it, even retained it on their shoe. And it was just so unnoticed. It was unnoticeable to most people. It seemed meaningless. But for those from his vantage, now Brian Edwards' vantage, it had a great deal of significance because it designated specific areas where teams were to take their shots from. And there we have it. Butch, I want to come back to a question, or not so much a question, but a concern that you raised last week. You know, I know that, first of all, let me say to everyone in the room here that the information that we have been exploring through this course, particularly the past 2 weeks, is really difficult and dark. And while some of it makes some sense, but I know for Butch, you had said right there, as a former military officer in the USMC, to think that particularly the Joint Chiefs of Staff would ever be party to the assassination of a chief executive officer. The one thing that I would point to, well, there'd be two things that I would point to. One would be Operation Zapata, aka the Bay of Pigs. Even though the president had said, okay, well, I'll let the CIA go forward with this, but there's going to be no military support for it. Well, in subordination of his order there, Admiral Arleigh Burke, commander of U.S. naval forces, he had a flotilla of aircraft carrier and Marines ready to launch. They were just beyond the horizon because he was certain that the president would have to relent and let them support the invasion. So even though there was a stand-down order, they were ready to go. The following year, they presented to the president a program known as Operation Northwoods. And this was a false flag operation that the US was going to conduct in the United States here with adversaries, in which we would be carrying out acts of terrorism in Florida, particularly in South Florida, and with the impression that this was being conducted by members of the Castro regime. And without going in, there's a lot more detail to Northwoods, but all of it was to give a pretext for the US to invade in 1962. And Kennedy said, gentlemen, put that away. I never want to see it again. So the Joint Chiefs were prepared to carry out this kind of activity in 62, which doesn't say that they're necessarily going to all line up and say, you know, okay, well, let's execute the president. But in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 62, led by Air Force General, member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, openly called Kennedy a spineless coward and a traitor. And that was the general consensus around the table. Now, I'm not saying it's the Coast Guard and the Commandant of the Marine Corps, but that was the general consensus of Lyman Lemnitzer, U.S. Army, Arleigh Burke, U.S. Navy, and Curtis LeMay, U.S. Air Force. So I'll leave it at that. All right, today we will come to, I'm going to call it an end, because I hope what I've raised with you here will interest you in pursuing this subject on your own. You know, the main source book, I showed a visual of it next week. I don't know what I did with it, it's around here somewhere. If you are interested, you know, please take a look at Philip Nelson's work, you know, LBJ, mastermind of the JFK assassination, because the things that I've brought forward are presented in that book, and he footnotes all of the information. There's a tremendous bibliography there as well. In today's course, I'll make reference to two of the other works on the source list there. Doug Horn, who served on the Assassination Records and Review Board. He's someone who is very critical of the autopsy, which we will be dealing with Bethesda today. And then also the work by John Armstrong, who his major work on Harvey and Lee. And as I mentioned to you last week, Harvey and Lee will both be in the school book depository, and we will deal with that in today's course here, today's class meeting. But before doing that, any questions that came up from anything that you might have seen from last week? Now, Kathy has mentioned she took a moment to look at the Madeline Brown interview. Did anybody else take a look at that? No, not that there's any.
Yeah, that was riveting. I mean, that was riveting.
Yeah, just to say the least. Yeah.
Madeline Duncan Brown says that when LBJ came out of a meeting, he said, "This time tomorrow, those SOBs will never belittle me again or embarrass me again," I think were the words. That's pretty condemning. Right?
Yep.
Right. And when the whole interview started, she said that this was not just that, months before, that this was brokered deal back at the time of the election, that when they brokered the deal, Murchison brokered the deal with Kennedy to get LBJ as his second, and then the fix was in at that point.
The deal was done.
Yeah.
The deal was done.
Yeah.
I did have one question though, John.
Go ahead, Butch.
You got to reread your notes, right? Every time you have one of these seminars or presentations, classes, because it all jumbles together if you don't. So right. I was rereading The Secrets of the JFK Assassination Archive, that thing by Scott Sayari, that was featured in the One Great Story, New York's reading recommendation letter, the Daily. And I quote, he says, 3 of the 7 members of the Warren Commission eventually disavowed the Warren Commission's finding, as did LBJ. And I looked at that again. I said, wait a minute. If LBJ wanted this situation to go away as one lone gunman, then why did he disavow it?
He disavowed it much later, but his purpose in creating, or through the assistant attorney general Nicholas Katzenbach, was to take the focus off of Cuba and a conspiracy there. It began with members of the Senate saying, we want to investigate this. And the last thing Johnson wanted to do was to have the Senate get into this, in which they would be having the FBI working on their behalf and sending investigators out there. The second reason it came up, and these were all within days after the killing, is that the Texas state legislator and investigative officers wanted to get it. And the last thing Johnson wanted there was to have another body getting in to investigate this. He was trying to put it to bed, because if there was any hint that there was a second gunman, that means there was a conspiracy, and the uninterrupted flow from one administration to the next would be in question. He wanted to move right from vice presidency into presidency without any hitch whatsoever. So the commission was formed within 10 days right there. He falsely brought in Chief Justice Earl Warren, and it was during the course of the investigation. I think it is Hale Boggs from Louisiana, and God, I'm missing the name. It's a Russell from Georgia. He was the first one to say this is all made up, and I'm not even going to show up. I think he went to 2 meetings and he never showed up again. And he said, I want to write a dissent to the Warren Commission. And the author of it said, okay, we'll include it. But when it came out, his dissent was not included. So I know it's Boggs, Russell, and I can't think of who the third member of the commission who was not party to it. And then Johnson, he just signed them. Yeah, I think there might have been a little conspiracy in here. But then it was so far down. Johnson needed to put to bed the Cuban connection. The Cuban connection had been being in process for well over a year. The CIA wanted to have this thing happen, get rid of Kennedy, but get a twofer. The death of Kennedy with Oswald as this commie, he's a fake commie, but he has associations to Cuba. It's going to give us license to go into Cuba and have the attack that we've wanted ever since 1959-60. And Johnson, he said, one is, he knew it because Hoover called him up and he said, the imposter that's been down in Mexico City in September doesn't look anything like Harvey Oswald. So we can't sell that story to the American people. So Johnson is trying to bring an end to the Havana connection. And it's going to take him 2 weeks because David Atlee Phillips, the CIA director of Western Hemisphere in Mexico City, has been working on this for a year. They've tried to set Oswald up as a commie, as a hitman for Castro, and this is going to give us license to go in there. So when it isn't needed anymore, and this is, several years afterwards, Johnson makes the admission that you're referring to right now. He doesn't need it anymore. Yeah, I think so too. He doesn't say, oh, and I was behind it. All right. But there we are. Anybody else? Okay.
John, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Didn't Johnson say that after he left office? Because I thought I saw an interview.
I think it is. He left. He was way out of office by that
Yeah,
point.
and he said
it was meaningless.
Yes.
Meaningless.
Because I saw that.
He's just thinking about his legacy at that point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me come down here and we'll get into today. And this is all about obviously today is about the cover-up. And all of the cover-up was planned well in advance, months, if not years beforehand. Because you need to have, because the CIA, who was practiced in assassination, knows that you need to have someone who you could quickly blame and let all the attention go to, and then put it to bed, so that nobody's thinking about this anymore. And that, of course, was the whole construction of the Harvey Oswald. We ended last week with the shooting on Elm Street and the quick drive to Parkland. So that's where we're picking up today. There is a view of Parkland at that time. The trauma rooms are up in that tower right there. This is a trauma room 1, and just 8 minutes after the shooting, Kennedy is in there with a team of doctors trying to save his life. He was dead effectively in the car. His third of his brain was blown out, but he had some autonomic reactions going. He was breathing. And so they thought, well, maybe we can do something to save the president. Against protocol, LBJ also went to Parkland with his wife and Senator Yarborough. Through one of his henchmen, LBJ ordered that the hospital's outgoing phone system and ingoing as well be blocked. And this was frustrating to members of the president's team who were trying to communicate back to Washington. Now, Johnson couldn't call either, but he wasn't concerned about phone calls at this point. But in addition, he orders that people go out and clean the limousine. Get out there with buckets and soap and water and sponges and clean that limousine out there. Now, anybody who knows about any bit of law enforcement knows that is obstruction of justice. That limousine is a crime scene and it needs to be preserved as is. But one of Johnson's first actions once they get there is get rid of the evidence. Now, here's where we're going to touch upon the story that broke back in October with Paul Landis. 10 years before Paul Landis, there's a gentleman named Sam Kinney. Sam Kinney is the driver of the Queen Mary. Sam Kinney, in the early 90s, told a neighbor of his named Gary Lukes that when he was at Parkland Hospital, he got the task of cleaning the presidential limousine. Now, as I say, all these guys are law enforcement officers. They know that they should not be doing this, but they're all doing it. They're all following the orders of the new boss. And they all recognize that LBJ, even though he hadn't been sworn in yet, that he's the new boss. He goes out there and he's cleaning. He says, he alleges, this is a story that he told to Gary Lukes, and he said, but don't ever tell this story to anyone, Gary. Sam Kinney passed away in 97, and Gary Lukes began to tell the following story in 2013, again, taking advantage of an anniversary year, the 50th anniversary. And this is what Gary Lukes said. Sam Kinney told me that he was ordered to go out and clean the limousine. And when he's out there cleaning the limousine, he found a whole bullet in the vehicle. And rather than call someone over, to be photographed and to bag it and go through the whole appropriate, collection of custody, he puts it in his pocket. He finishes sanitizing the limousine and goes into the hospital. Finding no superior, he instead places the bullet on a stretcher. Does that sound familiar? I mean, it's the same story that Paul Landis has just got through telling us this past few months ago. This is Sam Kinney in the lower photograph here with a Dallas police officer putting on the bubble top to the limousine, but this is occurring at Parkland Hospital. Inside trauma room 1, doctors realized there's no hope. He had about a third of his brain blasted out. More of it's continuing to drain out on the trauma table. But they did not declare him dead. Kennedy, as you know, was Catholic. They wanted to wait until a Catholic priest was summoned to offer him the last rites. And so not one, but actually 2 priests arrived in trauma room. They came, they administered the last rites to Kennedy, and with that, they declared him dead. But effectively, he was dead long before that. With that declaration, Johnson now leaves Parkland with his machine. But before the pronouncement of death, doctors had observed a small hole at the president's neck, which they identified as a bullet entrance wound. And these are very experienced doctors there. They're dealing with bullet wounds day in, day out. They know a bullet entrance wound from a bullet exit wound. One of them, the one we're showing here, Dr. Malcolm Perry, because the president's body was still trying to breathe, said, let's help the president try to breathe. So he opened up that entry wound by just fractions of an inch in order to insert tube for a tracheostomy. They judged that another bullet entrance wound right at JFK's hairline above his right eye. So those are 2 entrance wounds that they observed just from being with him in a prone position, flat on his back. They never turned him over, although at some point they did twist his head to see the gaping hole at the back of his head. And it's about the size of a closed fist. And they said, oh, well, we found the the exit wound for one of those. Trauma room 2, another team is working to save the life of Connolly, who's also shot. Now, he lapsed into unconsciousness with the shooting, and he only emerged from it sometime afterwards. And of course, his wife, shown in this photograph, Nellie, never left his side. But during the shooting, he allegedly said, "Oh, no, 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 my God, they are going to kill us all." Now, that could just be a phrase, because, you know, we'll hear that from Jacqueline Kennedy as well, the they. But Connolly is in that car. He knows the shooting is going to happen. I dare say he thought it was going to happen at the trademark, not on the motorcade. Boy, did he get a surprise, huh? Meanwhile, on the ground floor elevator lobby, Parkland employee Daryl Tomlinson was moving some stretchers. Now, he was tasked to stand at the bank of elevators in the lobby there and not to allow anyone who did not have permission to go up in the elevator. So he was there, and he was trying to make a little bit of room down there, and he was moving some of these stretchers around, and he bumped one against another, and lo and behold, a bullet dropped out of one of these stretchers. This is the only guy that seems to know how you should react. Instead of putting it in his pocket, he calls his superior. His superior is O.P. Wright. He's Parkland's security director. Now, just as an aside, O.P. Wright, prior to this position, he served as a deputy assistant chief of police for Dallas Police Department. So this guy, very familiar with weapons and with ammunition and procedures. He's now working for hospital security. He's the one that Tomlinson called, and he shows him what he found. After examining the bullet together, Wright then passed it along to Richard Johnson of Secret Service. Johnson carries the bullet back to DC, hands it to James Rowley, chief of Secret Service, and Rowley in turn gives the bullet to FBI agent Elmer Todd, who carried it to Robert Frazier in the crime lab. Ostensibly, that is the chain of custody going from Daryl Tomlinson right to the crime lab. But this is what the bullet that Daryl Tomlinson found on that stretcher and passed on to his superior, O.P. Wright. It had a partial copper jacket and a lead-pointed tip, and there is a key just to give us some sense of scale. Whereas this is the bullet that will be entered into evidence. It is a full copper jacket with a rounded tip, and the bullet had only slight marks at the tip and the end, hardly any loss of metal. Now, of course, this is the third bullet that they say actually goes through JFK's, the Warren Commission, through the questioning of Arlen Specter, will develop what we know as the magic bullet. They'll say that the bullet goes through the president's back of his neck, comes out his throat, makes a right-hand turn, goes into Connolly's back, comes out Connolly's chest after blowing out a rib, makes a left-hand turn, drops down, goes into Connolly's right wrist, and then ends in his left knee without any destruction or deformation of the bullet. So that was what was sold to the Warren Commission. This is the bullet that Tomlinson allegedly found, and this is the bullet that will end up in FBI and part of the National Archives. That's what you'll see there today. Furthermore, it is stated without supporting evidence that the stretcher from which it fell was the one that transferred Connolly into the trauma room. Who knows? But the bullet, I should say, the stretcher from which Tomlinson found this bullet was actually a bullet that had carried a child into Parkland Hospital earlier. This child was riding his bicycle. It was struck by a vehicle. This kid was bleeding profusely when they took him from whatever vehicle brought him into the hospital and set him on that stretcher. So if it was Sam Kinney who found this bullet and placed it there, he made the wrong decision. If it's Paul Landis 10 years later with his story, again, you know, the nurses at Parkland Hospital, they had a saying, I wish people would stop leaving bullets on our stretchers. It was becoming ridiculous. You know, I don't think Sam Kinney's story from 10 years ago is any more authoritative than the recent foolishness that we've heard from Paul Landis. These people have made these stories up to draw attention to themselves, and in Paul Landis's case, sell books. As I said, there's no explanation of how, during the chain of custody, the pointed tip bullet became the rounded tip bullet. But it will be the rounded tip bullet that will become the magic bullet. All right, let's set that aside. Back to trauma room 1. Staff pathologists, with the president having been declared dead, they're going to do an autopsy per Texas law. JFK's murder was a violation of state law, there not being a federal law against killing a president at this time. But they were stopped by Secret Service agent Roy Kellerman. He was the one riding shotgun in the motorcade. He said, hey, we have orders to take the president's body back to Washington, D.C. It doesn't say who gave us these orders, but we all know, we know who gave these orders. They could only have come from the top dog, and that is LBJ. During the discussion about possession of the body, which eventually became a very profane argument, Secret Service agents called O'Neill Mortuary, a local service in Dallas, for a casket. And they arrived with a hearse, and they placed JFK into an expensive bronze viewing casket, and they wrapped his head and body in sheets to staunch the bleeding. And during this activity, this profane argument grew worse until a phalanx of Secret Service agents encircled the casket and began forcibly to take it toward the hallway. Well, hospital staff is not going to relent. They've got to uphold Texas state law, as both the hospital's chief forensic officer and they brought in a justice of the peace to block the agents. Well, guess what? These agents are going to draw their weapons on these two Texas hospital authorities right there, and they're going to push them against the wall, and they say, get out of the way, we're taking the body. Furthermore, the two FBI agents who were assigned to stay with the body, they offered no resistance to the Secret Service agents, and they did not uphold Texas state law. They just stepped out of the way and let them roll away with the president's body. If we had had an autopsy at Parkland, all the discussion that we're having now and has occurred over the past 60 years would be mute. Or I should say moot. Anyway, throughout this profane exchange, First Lady remained close, except for a few moments during the trauma procedure. She had been with her husband's corpse since entering the hospital, and she rode in the O'Neill Mortuary hearse from Parkland to Love Field and Air Force One. And you can see the First Lady now. She's merely Jacqueline Kennedy with his death. She's no longer in that position. Let's go back to the ranch for a moment, huh? Go back to Washington, D.C. Because remember, there's a lot going back there. Throughout the morning at the Capitol, insurance broker Don Reynolds had been given testimony to the Senate Rules Committee regarding bribery and kickbacks to Bobby Baker and ultimately Lyndon Johnson. Reynolds came with documented evidence of the misdeeds. And boy, the committee was happy to receive all that, but they took a recess for lunch. When testimony resumed and Reynolds was about to continue his remarks, news of JFK's death interrupted the proceedings. Well, instead of continuing, Reynolds gathered up his materials and refused to speak further about Baker or LBJ. In his words, it's one thing to testify against a vice president. It's another thing to testify against the president. And he got out of that Senate Rules Committee and he never came back. And this is a wonderful image. This isn't LBJ and Bobby Baker at the moment, but it sure expresses how they must have felt. Because LBJ got his get out of jail free card with the president's death. Let's go back to Love Field and Air Force One, because that's where LBJ is headed. Having been declared dead at Parkland, a number of things happened quickly. Police Chief Curry drove LBJ to Love Field in his unmarked police car, but he felt it necessary to have the sirens blaring and to have an escort of police motorcycle officers. Once again, Johnson stayed low in the vehicle's back seat, but he shouted to Curry, "Turn that damn thing off. You're going to get us all killed." And there is the Chief Curry leaving with LBJ. Arriving at the field, LBJ demanded to be taken to Air Force One rather than the plane on which he had arrived. And when he got inside, he ordered that all the window curtains be closed and his baggage be transferred from Air Force Two, a seemingly unnecessary task since both planes would be returning to DC. And you can see the proximity of them. In the red, Air Force Two, and in the blue in the foreground, Air Force One. While still at Parkland, before they left, JFK aide Kenny O'Donnell had urged LBJ to get back to Air Force Two and return to the Capitol. But LBJ said, "I ain't gonna do that. I don't have to listen to you no more." In addition to showing that he was now in charge by refusing to take directions from JFK's aide, he wanted to wait for the arrival of the casket and, of course, Jacqueline Kennedy. And we'll soon know why. He was concerned about maintaining control of the dead president's body. Once he got inside Air Force One, I do want to mention there is absolutely no physical difference between Air Force One and Air Force Two. They are identical aircraft. The only difference is whichever plane, whichever aircraft the president steps on, that becomes Air Force One. The other one becomes automatically Air Force Two. If the president got off that one and went on to the other one, it just reverses. That one becomes. It's the plane, the aircraft that the president is on is one. But Johnson, he wanted to be on the blue plane, the one that brought in Kennedy and Jacqueline. And when he arrives and gets on Air Force One, first thing he does, he enters the presidential bedroom. I note here it had been occupied by JFK and Jacqueline just hours earlier. And he closed the door. And he goes into the powder room of there, and he has a breakdown, an emotional breakdown. Now, this gentleman who we see in the photograph here, this is JFK's military aide, General Godfrey McHugh. He learns that LBJ is on the plane. He said, why is he doing here? So he goes looking up from one end of the plane to the other to find LBJ, cannot find him. And he goes back and forth. Finally, he says, I've looked everywhere. I haven't looked in the toilet in the presidential headquarters. He does that, he opens the door, and he finds LBJ sitting on the toilet, sobbing. Now, whether this is real or feigned, we don't know. But at any rate, McHugh looked at him and he slapped LBJ across the face and he said, "Snap out of it." And LBJ continues to slobber on. McHugh slaps him a second time. And with that, LBJ, got it together. He regains his composure. McHugh leaves the room, and LBJ takes off his coat and his shirt, and he lays back on one of the two beds here. And from the galley staff, he orders up a sandwich and a scotch. It's either going to be J&B or Cuddy. And he begins to make a series of phone calls. Remember, when he was at Parkland, he couldn't make phone calls either. Nobody could. But once he's in the plane, he begins making phone calls. And I'll mention this. All the phone calls that have come off of Air Force One and Air Force Two are recorded, but only when the plane is in flight. So all of these phone calls that LBJ is making from when they're on the tarmac here are unrecorded. His first phone call is to his, isn't this the name? We're all going to call our tax attorney, right? And that's what LBJ does. He calls his tax attorney and he places some sell trades from his portfolio. Oh, I got to get rid of my goddamn Halliburton stock. Well, it goes through the cellar here. They discussed how much the market was down, but they had a laugh. It was not down as much as when FDR had passed away. Sometime later, First Lady arrives and watched her husband's casket onboarded to the plane. And that's what we see in the upper photograph here. Afterwards, Jacqueline enters the plane. With that done, the First Lady sought a moment of privacy in the presidential bedroom. She opens the door and is shocked to find the shirtless LBJ sitting back, drinking, carrying on these phone conversations. How about that? Startled, LBJ got up, surrendered the bedroom to the First Lady. But later he would return with Lady Bird with a white dress for Jacqueline Kennedy to wear instead of the blood-soaked outfit that she has on right at this moment. But Jacqueline Kennedy says, "No, I want them to see what they have done to my husband." And there it is. And you can see from the blood pattern on her dress right there that when the president was shot, he was bleeding from the back of his head onto her shoulder and lap. While the First Lady found privacy in the bedroom, members of JFK staff had been asked by LBJ's staff to vacate the aft compartment so that the casket could be secured. They had to remove a few of the seating so they could secure the casket to the floor of the aircraft here. And after JFK staff left, not only did they secure the casket to the floor, they opened it up. They opened it up and they removed JFK's sheet-wrapped body from the bronze casket, and they transferred it out through the starboard galley door. And they placed it in the aft luggage compartment directly below. How about that? And this is where the body would stay during the flight back to Washington, D.C.
Can I ask a question?
Go right ahead.
How did they know that? How do we know that that happened? Were there pictures of them doing it or something?
Let's come to that in just a moment here. Everything will become illuminated in just a moment. I know it's kind of stunning, isn't it? Well, with the First Lady now aboard, JFK said, "Okay, we've been holding here. Let's get off the ground now." But they're frustrated that Air Force One continues to sit motionless on the tarmac. and a staff member went up to the pilot's cabin to find out, why aren't we departing? Well, they discovered that LBJ ordered them to stay put. He's waiting for a local federal judge to arrive and administer the oath of office. Now, he doesn't need this. Constitution transfers power immediately upon death of the president. The oath is unnecessary. LBJ, however, is aiming for a historic photo opportunity to embellish his image and authority with the public. This was all thought out in advance. He wanted a seamless transition from Kennedy to Johnson, so no one would question. When the federal judge arrived, LBJ asked Jacqueline, join me in the stateroom. In fact, he invited everyone on board to join him in the stateroom for this ceremony. And there it is, just a few minutes before beginning. And here it is during the swearing in, although reluctant to leave her husband's body, members crowded into the stateroom for that 15-minute event. And here is the swearing in ceremony. But take a look. Someone who took this photograph said, hey, wait a minute, this isn't dramatic enough. Somebody turn the overhead lights on. So they turn the overhead lights on, and that's usually the image that is published. But I want to point out something here. In the upper photograph, you can see LBJ's left hand on a book. Now, normally, presidents are sworn in on using a King James version of the Bible. Well, Kennedy, being a Catholic, he did not have a King James version of the Bible on board Air Force One. He did have a Catholic missal. Those of you who are familiar with Catholic practice, the missal is a booklet that has the liturgy for the Mass on various Sundays and various holy days. And I showed this little insert here. This is the book that they found in the presidential quarters, the bedroom on board Air Force One. So they brought that out, and LBJ, the good Baptist, he swore on the Catholic missal. Though dismayed that she had not changed out of her blood-soaked outfit, LBJ took the oath of office with Jacqueline Kennedy on one side and Lady Bird on the other. But we're going to get into another little very revealing photograph right here. Once that oath of office was finished, LBJ turns to his right and he receives a wink from this gentleman just above Lady Bird's head right there. That person right there is Congressman Albert Thomas. Now, you'll remember one of the reasons, compelling reasons, that both Connally and LBJ persuaded him to come back to Texas was, you got to show some love to Albert Thomas. He's thinking of retiring and he's cutting back on your space program. He's not feeling the love. Albert Thomas is on board Air Force One, and the moment this swearing over, he exchanges a wink, and you can see it in this colorized, enlarged image right down below here. It's like, our plan has succeeded. Now, it may be just an innocent wink, but I don't think so. And then the swearing in breaks up. First Lady goes back to the aft compartment, and that's where she will ride for the journey back to Washington, D.C., as will other members of JFK's staff. They're going to be with the casket and Jacqueline Kennedy. All of Johnson's team is going to be up front here having their own little celebration. And I go back to this image that I showed early on. When 12 years old, Lyndon Johnson proclaimed, someday I'm going to be president of the United States. And other kids said, well, I'm not going to vote for you. And to which he said, I won't need your votes. And indeed, he did not need anyone's vote to become president. All right, let's take a trip to Bethesda here. Actually, let me stop for just a moment. and answer some other questions that we have here before I go on here. And I'll come into the galley. Does anybody have anything you want to raise with me before I go into Bethesda?
John,
Go ahead, Bob.
you talked about the limo. This past week I watched a lot of videos about this, but the limo, they cleaned it out. And I thought they said that within 6 months, they completely rebuilt it. They had the chrome piece across the front was replaced almost immediately. The windshield was replaced right after the shooting. But they rebuilt that Lincoln, I think,
Yep.
within 6 months. So,
And Bob, it was happening even earlier than that. They went through a much,
yeah,
they cleaned it out. And the day that it got back to DC, because they hauled it back in one of the cargo planes, they shipped it up to a Ford Motor Plant in Cincinnati, took
Right.
out the windshield, and then they sent it up to Dearborn, and they completely did out the whole inside. And this was within days.
yes.
And then 6 months down the road, then they completely remodeled it. It's the remodeling that took place within 6 months.
Right.
All evidence was removed from the limousine.
Right.
Anybody else?
The bullets, the chain of custody, you talked about the bullets.
Mhm.
Think about how many people handled those, and the person who loaded the bullet, even if it's the trajectory, if it goes into something, it still leaves a print, part of a print, unless it goes in flesh and it wouldn't, but still, wouldn't you would think that they would be looking for fingerprints on those.
Well, they could have used gloves.
Yeah, but still, anyway.
Well, usually what happened, once that the bullet that entered into evidence is not whatever bullet they found or that Tomlinson found in Dallas.
Right.
Whatever was entered into the chain of custody began in Washington, D.C. And all of the people who began to take custody of it scratched their initials on it. So those are there, but it's only after it arrives at D.C.
Okay.
And it's clearly a full metal jacket bullet right there, not the partial half that was found in Dallas. But who knows whether, how that bullet ended on that stretcher, we have no idea.
Well, the other thing too is if they had 4 teams, as this guy was speculating in the video, 4 to 6 teams, how many bullets were there in that automobile?
There was different, clearly different ammunition. Some of it would have been underpacked, so it didn't make the sound when it comes out of the barrel.
Subsonic, yes.
It was subsonic, and it also hit with less impact, so it didn't penetrate the body. They were different. One of the last bullet that struck the president's head was a frangible bullet, meaning that when it hit, once it came apart into pieces, and that's what really blew out the president's brain. Because there was another bullet the one that hit him above the right hairline here, went in but just traversed his skull right here. It was the second one that hit almost afterwards, hitting his right temple. That's the one that blew out the back. So there was kind of a boom boom effect right there. But that's kind of getting it. Let me just get a little bit ahead of ourselves.
Well, and the fact that there were no bullets found in the bodies, either of Connolly or JFK.
But well, we'll get it. We're going to get in that right now.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Right.
But before I do, anything on what we just covered before I get into Bethesda? Okay. Here it comes. When Air Force landed at Andrews in DC, its port side was illuminated with lights. And I'm sure many of you who were young adults or children witnessed this. Television cameras were focused on the removal of the bronze casket. And this is the image that we all saw. They had that lift that came up. They brought the bronze casket. You can see it in the back of the truck. Now, this ambulance that we see here, this light blue, this was not there to receive the casket. It is a cardiac ambulance from the U.S. Navy. They had sent it there to care for LBJ in case he was having a cardiac event. LBJ had had a massive heart attack back in the 50s, and they were concerned that he might be, because of the stress, he might be having a cardiac event. But they used this vehicle here to decide, let's just transport the casket. What is going on as we go through here is they tried to separate Jacqueline Kennedy from the casket. They thought they could get her out of the plane and take her somewhere, and they could take the casket off separately. But she refused to be separated from the casket. And once her brother-in-law, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, arrived at Andrews, got on the plane, he and she were inseparable from the casket. So we went through this big ceremony of removing the casket. Now I'm going to show up here. If you see where my cursor is at, right up at the port entry here, you see a burial, a ceremonial burial team. These are members of each of the services in dress uniform. They are there as part of a ceremony to receive the commander-in-chief. Cameras show to a mourning nation the casket as it's placed into the Navy ambulance. First Lady, Robert Kennedy, who met her, they follow the casket into the ambulance. Here it is right there. And again, going back up to the port entrance, to the port entry here, you see the ceremonial team right here. These guys are going to try to stay along. But First Lady in pink, Robert Kennedy, they get in the ambulance with the casket. LBJ gets off of Air Force One. He makes his brief remarks. Let us continue. Remember that one? He then boarded a military helicopter that was on the starboard side of Air Force One. In fact, there were 3 helicopters on the starboard side of Air Force One in the dark. Couldn't see them. He goes back to White House. He's taken over with the lights and camera turned off. JFK's sheet-wrapped body was removed from Air Force One's starboard aft luggage compartment, and it was placed aboard another helicopter, and that helicopter lifted off and made the short flight to Bethesda Naval Hospital. Touchdown in the parking lot near the Officers Club at Bethesda, the helicopter carrying JFK's body was met by a black Cadillac hearse of a local mortuary that was contacted in advance. JFK's body was stripped of the sheets from Parkland Hospital and placed into a zippered body bag. The body bag was placed into a shipping casket, very much like what we see here. And this shipping casket was then placed in the hearse, and the hearse drove the short distance from the Officers Club parking lot to Bethesda morgue entrance. And there it was met by naval personnel at 6:35 p.m. All of this is documented. And it was immediately taken into the morgue. 20 minutes later, 6:55, the gray Navy ambulance arrives at the lobby entrance to Bethesda, and there Jacqueline and Robert get out and they enter the hospital through the main entrance. The ambulance, for whatever reason, they put William Greer, that scallywag, and Roy Kellerman, that scallywag, inside, and they are the ones that are driving the ambulance, and they sit there in front of the entrance to Bethesda for 12 minutes after Jacqueline and Robert get off, until the 2 FBI agents who are tasked with staying with the body, following in a separate vehicle, get out and they say, hey, what are we doing here? And with that, Greer starts up the engine and he drives around to the back of the morgue, the hospital, and they deliver the now empty bronze casket. Greer, Kellerman, and the 2 FBI agents lift this bronze casket out of the ambulance, and they take it into the anteroom of the morgue, and it is clocked in at 7:17. These agents are James Siebert, who we see in this photograph here. Excuse me, this is Francis O'Neill, but the two agents are James Siebert, who I haven't had a photograph of, and Francis O'Neill. They were stopped from going any further, even though it was their orders to stay with the body and collect any evidence that is found in the autopsy. So they are separated from the body they've been separated from the body a long time, but as far as they know, the body is in this bronze casket. But they're not going to see when they open it up that there's nothing in there. Meanwhile, a pickup truck that had been commandeered at Andrews, carrying that 7-man casket team that I was pointing out, they'd been trying to follow the ambulance. And they arrive at the hospital entrance, but there's no ambulance there. So they catch sight of a second Navy ambulance. But this is a decoy. And they go chasing after this decoy ambulance. And they are chasing it around the rather extensive hospital grounds at Bethesda, trying to catch up to it. At times, this chase exceeded 50 miles an hour. After a futile chase and a search for the ambulance, the casket team goes back to the hospital. They're at the rear. Hospital said, "We've not seen any ambulance here." Casket team returns to the hospital entrance. Nothing there. In desperation, they go back to the rear entrance, the morgue entrance. And at this time, they see an ambulance parked at the hospital's rear. And it's now 8 o'clock. The driver of this ambulance is not William Greer and partner Roy Kellerman. This time, it's a full-fledged admiral, Calvin Galloway, the man in charge of the entire medical center and immediate superior of the man who was slated to perform the autopsy, Commander James Humes. And of course, what's in your mind here right now? I know it's begging the question, what is this shell game all about? LBJ needed to have the wounds in JFK's body conform to the story of a single shooter firing from behind. So before JFK's body could be autopsied, it needed to be pre-autopsied. It needed any contrary evidence removed. So while the casket team has been chasing this decoy, the autopsy team of Humes and another Navy doctor, Commander Thornton Boswell, they were working on the body of JFK that had been delivered by the Black Hearse. And this shows you a diagram of what had happened. When that shipping casket, I'll let my cursor here just follow the arrows, it was brought in, set on the table. They removed the body. They did the pre-autopsy on table 1 here. And when they were done, by that time, the casket had arrived, left out in the anteroom. Staff then brought it into the cooler room here without the FBI agents around to witness this. And with the pre-autopsy done, they put JFK's body into the burial casket. And now the ceremonial team will be asked to come in to bring it in. This is a 3D drawing of what that space looked like. So here is the entrance where the anteroom is at. Here are the dissection tables in this area right here. And this is the gallery where visitors will be witnessing the autopsy. What happened in the pre-autopsy is simply this. Boswell and Humes took a bone saw and they cut a large opening on the top of JFK's skull. And in that opening, they searched for and removed up to 10 metal fragments of bullets from the brain. Humes and Boswell also greatly enlarged the small tracheostomy and searched for additional bullet fragments from the throat. Confident that they'd gotten everything, JFK's body, now mutilated but sanitized, was transferred back to the bronze casket as if the chain of custody had never been broken. And at this time, 8 o'clock, the honor guard was summoned and it carried the casket into the official autopsy. And there is a drawing of Humes and Boswell, and they brought in an army doctor as well, Pierre Fink, but he came in like a half an hour late, so he missed all this other stuff. As I note right here, when the pre-autopsy was complete, they carried out the official autopsy, but essentially it was a charade. The autopsy room was crowded, a few civilians, Jacqueline and Robert Kennedy, but primarily military officers, generals and admirals. Air Force General Curtis LeMay, the highest ranking officer, and when Humes said, "Who's in charge here?" Humes answered, "I am." Soon after, JFK's personal physician, George Berkeley, entered. He began giving orders to everyone, even those with higher rank, and he ordered the doctors to focus only on JFK's head and chest, and he specifically ordered them not to track the throat wound. By 11 p.m., the charade of an autopsy was complete. The officers and civilians departed. Humes and Boswell, however, will stay with JFK's body, and they will work for hours longer, along with mortuary staff, to repair the mutilation that they had carried out earlier. And what do I mean by that? JFK had a massive wound, as I said, about the size of a closed fist at the back and lower portion of his head. None of that is seen in these images here. Instead, they had cut a giant hole at the top of his head. New and misleading photographs were taken, which showed the back of JFK's head as seemingly intact, something that was not seen by any of the witnesses, either in Parkland or Bethesda. In addition, x-rays were taken of JFK's head. These lateral skull x-rays were forgeries. In the words of an expert's analysis, a very dense optical patch was superimposed on the copy films over the occipital parietal area, behind the ear, to mask the blowout or exit wound seen in the back of the head. So they forged this skull x-ray. I've got maybe my cursor in here if I can. Where's my cursor here? Come on. Oh, I went too far. This area right in here, this is where the president's head is blown out, right in this area here. And they had to cover that up with other bone tissue to make it seem as if this is the area of the blowout, so that the entrance wound is here where this arrow is at, and where this descending red arrow, this is where the blowout was seen right there. All of this was a forgery. Neither the photographs or the x-rays would be part of the Warren Commission report, however. Instead of using photographs, they had an artist come in and make drawings from those photographs. What you see here is a drawing, I'll back it up here, of this. This is the photograph. This is a drawing of that photograph, and this is what was submitted to the Warren Commission. All right. A final word, but it's not really. The assassination of President Kennedy, as I said at the outset, was the firing of an executive by the actual powers that be in our nation. It was a firing in a brutal public manner intended to send a message. And the message is this: we rule, and the rest of you are mere subjects. let me stop for a moment here. Again, I'll address some questions that come in here in case anybody has something. I'll go back to you, Margaret, your question. How do we know they switched the body out? Well, we know they switched it out because the body arrived in a shipping casket. And the only time they had an opportunity to remove the body was when it was placed in the aft compartment of Air Force One, and they chased everyone out saying, well, we need to secure it, so just give us a few minutes. And during that time, the body was lifted out, the casket was closed, and they put the body in the the luggage compartment below. And that's where the president's body remained until it arrived at Andrews Air Force Base. All right.
Just to, I have a question then. Throughout all this, LBJ was not present, but these
Right.
were his minions throughout
Right.
this whole thing, and it was all pre-planned.
Correct. Well, I'll back it up a little bit. They were having to improvise a little bit here, Lori, because they thought they could separate the First Lady, that Jacqueline Kennedy, from the body. And when they arrived at Andrews, and it was clear that she was not going to leave the body, they had to figure something else out. So they were improvising at that time there. And so, okay, let's take the casket and move it over here, and we'll get her pulled off to Bethesda, and we'll bring the body, as we've already separated it, separately. And that's why it was flown in a helicopter, arrived 20 minutes earlier. It gave them the opportunity that they needed to do all this pre-autopsy work.
So, John, what you're saying is that Jacqueline did not know, and neither did his brother, that the casket did not contain his body.
Correct. And neither did anybody on watching this on television. And that would include me. I was a 10-year-old boy watching this, and I was just glued to the television, and we all thought, hey, and there was this great ceremonial aspect to this, but it was all, like I'd like to say, it was all theater, baby. It's all theater.
The other thing is all these details that you're now bringing forward.
Mhm.
How did all of that information come forward?
That information came forward. There's two people that are really responsible for that. One of them is someone who I mentioned early on in episode 1. He's not one of the first responders. His name is David Lifton. Wrote a book called The Best Evidence that he published in 1980. And it was a bestseller, brought a lot of attention, but then that information, he's the one who put this supposition out there. But then it all faded away for 20 years until Jim Garrison's book and Jim Marr's book in the late 80s brought attention to this, and Oliver Stone licensed both these books, and he used them as the basis for his movie JFK in 91, and that opened up this conversation again and brought about the JFK Act and the release of millions of documents in the mid-1990s. Now, and one of the people who served on that Assassination Records Review Board is someone who is on your source list there. He's number 2, Doug Horn. He has a 6-volume work. He had the opportunity to see all this information, and he has written about it extensively. But I'm confident that you haven't ever seen anything about this on CBS or the New York Times or the Fox News or anywhere. They're never going to talk about this. You, as an American citizen, have to go out and dig it up. Or in this case, you've come to a nice OLLI class here at University of Art.
You've done the digging for us.
I'm just the messenger. All the work was done by these people here, Doug Horn, but he goes into it very extensively, and he, documented, because he's had the opportunity to look at all the documentation of these military personnel that were at Bethesda, and I received the body and they charted it all down. Of course, all these people were sworn, you can never talk about this under threat of court-martial. So it was just decades later, and it was only with the JFK Act that the opportunity to break these, I'll call them non-disclosure acts, or these their oaths that they'd taken, that they were able to bring this forward. Anybody else? Otherwise, I didn't think we'd have time to do it, but we do have time for me to talk about this gentleman here, Oswald. Let me go into it. Because this, well, I won't wrap things up completely, because what we see with the effective autopsy here, and they're all trying to plant the story, one gunman, school book depository, 3 shots, 2 of them hit. And that's all. There's no conspiracy. We want a seamless transition from Kennedy to Johnson. That is the point. Yep, let me get back here. On the morning of November 22nd, as I indicated to you, both the Harvey Oswald, this is the young man that was born in Europe, was fluent in Russian, and was brought over to the United States here in the aftermath of World War II. Lee Oswald is born in New Orleans. Both of them were in the school book depository that day. Harvey, however, was unaware that Lee was with him. Prior to the shooting, Lee was making his presence known at a window on the 6th floor. He was seen by some 40 prisoners from their windows in the adjacent county jail. Now, he wasn't poking a weapon out, he was just poking his head out. But these guys could all see him. Of course, none of their testimony was taken into consideration. He wasn't shooting, he was being seen. Immediately after the shooting, however, Lee quickly descended to the 2nd floor in a nearby elevator. Now, throughout the shooting, Harvey Oswald, he's wearing a long sleeve brown shirt. And I'm going to continue to refer to the clothing they were wearing because it's just as distinctive. So there's a Lee Oswald and a Harvey Oswald. Lee Oswald is wearing a white t-shirt. Harvey Oswald is wearing a long sleeve brown shirt. And he's on the 2nd floor having his lunch. Anyway, stopped by the commotion on the 2nd floor when he's just come down through the elevator, Lee changes directions and heads toward the entry staircase that would take him to the floor below. He wants to get down to the 1st level. Again, still wearing his white t-shirt, Lee was seen by another school book depository employee, Mrs. Reed, and she saw him drinking a Coca-Cola. Once the commotion had passed up on the 2nd floor, Lee went down to the 1st floor and headed across to the loading dock. And I'm going to show you a diagram of what I mean. Here's a layout of the 2nd floor school book depository. Here's Houston Street. Here's Elm Street. Here is if this was on the 6th floor, this is where the alleged shooting took place from. At any rate, Lee Oswald came down from the 6th floor in this elevator right here, where you see me wiggling my cursor here. He gets out of the elevator and he follows the red line. You follow me with this, up to here until he gets to this area right here. And this is where the commotion is at. Rather than wait it out or persist, he changes direction, now following the green line, and he heads back to where he just came from. This is where he runs into Mrs. Reed. And then he goes down these staircase to the 1st floor. Okay. What was the commotion? Well, shortly after the shooting, Dallas motorcycle officer, M.L. Baker, and these are the only Dallas police officers that were reacting to the shooting at all. It was the motorcycle officer. One of them was M.L. Baker, dropped his motorcycle within 90 seconds. he's heading into, because he said, I saw a flock of pigeons. I heard a shot and I saw a flock of pigeons fly up into the air from the roof of the school book depository. So I thought something must have happened in there. Gets off his motorcycle, goes into the main entrance, and there he runs into the building supervisor. You can see on the right-hand photograph here. This is Roy Truly. Roy had been standing outside watching the motorcade, but with Baker coming in here, the two of them linked up, and Truly will lead Baker into the building, and they go up the first floor and then across to the second floor where the main staircase is at. But before they get to that staircase on the second floor, Baker sees through a window in a doorway that leads into this little lunchroom, someone standing in there, and he bursts into that room and he draws his gun on him. The person in the lunchroom there was Harvey Oswald. And Truly says, don't worry about him, he works here. So Baker holsters his weapon, and the two of them back out of the lunchroom, and they go back over to this staircase right here. This is the only staircase that's going to go up all the floors. That's why they have to get to the second floor here. And all that was taking place inside this lunchroom here. For some reason, the power went out in the building at this time, and these two elevators here were inoperative. As I note right here, Baker challenged Oswald, Truly vouched for him. At this time, he's wearing the long-sleeved dark brown shirt. Baker and Truly back out, and they head up this staircase right here. Now, other people are coming down this staircase, female employees, and this is an old wooden staircase. You can hear everything that's on it. And they said, no one has passed us. So no one has come down or come up. At any rate, Harvey Oswald will leave that lunchroom, go out the front door, because people in the employees are saying, let's go home. Half the employees will leave the school book depository at this time. Harvey Oswald will go down the street on Elm Street, and he'll pick up a regular bus. It's bus 1213. And that's what we see in the photograph here. And he's going to take this bus, and it's going to convey him right toward the action on Dealey Plaza and the triple overpass. There must be somewhere he intends to go that's taking him right back into the scene of the action. However, I want to point something out. This isn't just a random photograph of bus 1213. This Kodak moment was captured by a 30-year Army veteran by the name of Stuart Reed. And up to this time, he'd been serving as secretary to the Army's Office in Personnel Management. And he just happened to be in Dallas, just happened to be on Elm Street, just happened to have a camera, and just happened to photograph Harvey Oswald step on bus 1213. That's the image that Stuart Reed took moments after the killing of the president. After going a short distance, however, the bus stalled in traffic. All the commotion in Dealey traffic in Dealey Plaza was causing congestion. Rather than stay on the bus, Harvey Oswald gets off the bus and he hails a taxi. And guess what? Stuart Reed was right there to capture that Kodak moment as well. This is the bus as Harvey Oswald is getting off of it. And you can see its relationship to the school book depository. By the way, moments after Harvey got off the bus, 2 policemen got on the bus and began to search each of the passengers. It's as if they were expecting to find someone there. One of these policemen was in plainclothes and the other was in uniform. These officers were Captain Westbrook. He is head of personnel for Dallas Police Department. Suddenly he finds himself acting like he's a homicide detective. And the other is Reserve Officer Kenneth Croy. He's the one in uniform. Here's an overview of what was kind of going to happen right then. So Oswald had, here's Dealey Plaza. Oswald had gotten on a bus. The bus had gone a few blocks and then it stopped. Oswald got off. He caught a taxi. This is the route the taxi took back over to the Oak Cliff area of Dallas. This is the rooming house where Oswald was staying. But rather than get off there, he had the taxi take him a few more blocks and drop him off here. Oswald will walk back to his rooming house. I'll come back to this image later. Stuart Reed, our 30-year Army employee, he's not done taking photographs. He also stops in Dealey Plaza, looks up at the school book depository, and takes this image of the building. You know, you never know when you're going to need a photo of the Texas School Book Depository, and it captures the window of the 6th floor right there. It also had shown last week, this is the window of the 5th floor where other employees were looking out of it. In the midst of all of this action, Lee Oswald finally will leave the school book depository through the loading dock and make his way toward Elm Street. So I'm going to go back to another graphic here. As I said, Lee Oswald came off the 2nd floor, got down here, get my cursor in here, to this area of the 1st floor, crosses across the 1st floor, goes out the back door, goes off the loading dock, crosses around here, and here's Elm Street, and there is going to be a car waiting to pick him up. It's a Nash Rambler, and it had been sitting there for a few minutes. And the moment Lee comes out of the building, he's in it, and the car takes off. Now, this officer here, Roger Craig, he sees this vehicle stop there. Actually, he's not a police officer, he's a deputy sheriff. He arrived at the Dealey Plaza, he'd been looking for evidence. He sees this Rambler parked there and this guy come out running to it. He goes over and tries to stop them and question them, but because of traffic going along Elm, couldn't get to them, it drives off. That's not the last we're going to hear of Roger Craig, though. This is an overview of how it looked. So this is how you can see where Lee Oswald came out the back door, loading dock, came out the back here, crossed that, got in the Nash Rambler, parked right there, and off they went. And Officer Craig was on the south side of Elm Street here, tried to get across, but cars were coming too many at that time. Afterwards, Craig will go into the building and join 2 of his colleagues. They're going to search each floor of the school book depository for evidence, and the 3 of them together will find and identify a 7.65 Mauser with a scope on it. And this is the Mauser right there. And how do we know what was a Mauser? Well, it had Mauser stamped right into the metal on the weapon itself. Plus, one of these 3 officers had previously owned a gun store and was very familiar with weapons of all kinds, and they correctly identified it. And on those first days, hours of on the newscast about the assassination, everybody was saying, we found a weapon. It's a Mauser, 7.65, 7.65, 7.65, all weekend. And then finally, the weapon that's been found is a Mannlicher Carcano, and it's a 6.5. No explanation how we went from this to that. Later that afternoon, Craig would identify Harvey Oswald as, rather than Lee, as the person whom he had witnessed running from the school book depository and getting in the Rambler station. But you'll notice from this image right here, they made Harvey Oswald take off his long sleeve brown shirt so he would look like the Lee Oswald. By the way, that Rambler wagon, a vehicle very similar to it was owned by Ruth Paine, the CIA handler who, along with her estranged husband, Michael, had been involved with Oswald soon after their return from, I said the Soviet Union here, but I really mean to say New Orleans, when they were ordered back to New Orleans. At some point, after being driven away in the Rambler, Lee Oswald acquired a white jacket and a .38 revolver. This was in preparation for his appearance in the adjacent Oak Cliff neighborhood. Yeah, things aren't done with. The shooting was Act 1. Oak Cliff is Act 2. Meanwhile, Harvey Oswald rode in the taxi from Dallas to the aforementioned Oak Cliff neighborhood. Had the driver bypass his residence, then he got out and he walked back, just as I described here. Taxi took him from here, dropped him here, and he walked back up to his rooming house. Now, eventually where he's going to end up is, I'm waving over here, this is in the lower left corner is the Texas Theater, okay? Well, we've got things to cover in this area right here. Harvey Oswald arrived at his boarding house that he used as his residence during his work week. His housekeeper, Earlene Roberts, was watching a soap opera that had been interrupted by a news bulletin. She asked, "Hey, have you heard the news?" But he didn't even answer. He just went right into his room. And in the few minutes that he was there, he took off his brown shirt, changed out his white t-shirt on and put a fresh one on. And then he put back on his brown long sleeve shirt and he pocketed a .38 revolver. Unknown to him, since he had never fired it, that gun was inoperative. That weapon was inoperative. Its hammer, or the firing pin on that hammer, had been filed down so it could never strike the bullet that was in the chamber. And he didn't know that. Anyway, while Oswald is getting ready, Mrs. Robert, Earlene, right there in the foreground, observed an unmarked police car stop in front of the house, and it honked twice, beep, beep. And then the unmarked police car, occupied by Captain Westbrook and Sergeant Croy, then drove away. Oswald comes out of his room, leaves the residence. Mrs. Roberts observes him cross the street to wait at a bus stop. But after just a moment, Oswald changes his mind, crosses back, and he walks in the opposite direction that bus would have taken him. And he goes out of sight. And then we lose him. But shortly, Oswald will arrive at the local movie house. Now I'm going to back up here so you can see it in this scheme. So he's up here at his rooming house. He steps outside, crosses the street, and we lose sight of him. But he ends up down here in the left corner at Texas Movie Theater, and it's just a short while later. Judging from the fact that Harvey is carrying two halves of separate dollar bills, he anticipated meeting a contact in the dark theater who would provide him with the orders and the means for his next move. And what he does when he gets in that theater, I'll mention, this is a 900-seat theater. You know, they don't make them too many like these anymore. I'm sure you have a few of them left in the state of Arkansas. I know we have a few of them here in Southern California, but they are far and few between. There's only like 20 people sitting in this enormous house. Oswald proceeds to go into this theater while the trailers are showing and the movie starts, and sit beside each person. imagining that they could be his contact. No one responds to him when he flashes a dollar bill. So he gets up and he goes to the next one. Nothing happened. He goes to the next one. He goes through all 20 people until finally he gets to the back of the theater thinking, my contact hasn't arrived here yet. And that's where he'll be at when the police arrive. But we've got to have something happen before the police arrive. In an adjacent neighborhood, that is Oak Cliff, J.D. Tippit is sitting in a parked patrol car on a residential street, blocking a narrow driveway that serves two homes. But this is no ordinary street. In fact, Tippit was well known in this neighborhood. They knew him as Officer Friendly. And in fact, he'd been in this neighborhood so often because his girlfriend lived in one of those two houses, even though he's a married fella. He's got a girlfriend there and he's there a lot. They thought he lived there. And here we can see Officer Tippit's car parked in the street. To the left of the car, you can see the cutaway of this curb cut there where the driveway goes up to the residential homes there. According to witnesses, Lee Oswald, now wearing a white jacket over his white t-shirt, approached the patrol car and chatted with Tippit through the passenger window. While this conversation was occurring, the unmarked police car that I've mentioned approached the scene from this driveway, and I'll wave my cursor here. Behind those houses was an alleyway, and that unmarked car came up the alleyway, and now it was driving through the driveway directly toward Tippit's car, but it stayed back and parked where the houses were at. Didn't come out this far. So while this conversation was occurring, the car comes up and on the driveway that is blocked by Tippit's car. Tippit sees it, evidently, and he gets out of his vehicle, seemingly without, and he comes, and I'll back up here, let me back up. And so Tippit gets out of his vehicle here, and he comes around the front end. This is as far as he gets, right where I'm waving my cursor at. Doesn't even get in front of the hood. Without provocation, Lee Oswald shot Tippit 3 times with his .38 revolver, one shot hitting him directly in the heart, killing him instantly. He was dead before his body hit the asphalt there. According to witnesses, Lee walked toward the rear of the patrol car and then stepped back toward Tippit. At that moment, a man from the unmarked police car, Captain Westbrook, he spoke to Lee and said, "Finish the job." Lee fired a 4th shot from a revolver into Tippit's head to serve as a coup de grace. And with that, the two men walked away from the murder scene in opposite directions. Where my cursor is at the moment here is the bloodstain. That's where Tippit fell and bled out. Lee walks down the street emptying shells from his revolver while Westbrook returns to his unmarked car in the driveway. Out of that unmarked car steps Sergeant Croy. He gets out and he approaches Tippit's body. Croy would be the first officer on the scene and the one who would call it in. Westbrook, he will back his vehicle down the driveway until he hits the alleyway and then exit the scene. A short distance away, however, Westbrook will meet up again with Lee Oswald. Lee will give Westbrook his revolver and his white jacket, and get this, also a wallet. Westbrook delivered Lee then to the Texas Theater. Harvey Oswald has already arrived at the Texas Theater, and now Westbrook is driving Lee Oswald to the Texas Theater. Having done that, Westbrook is going to drive to the Texas School Book Depository to await the news bulletin about an officer down, an officer's been shot. And it didn't take long. Soon, an all-points bulletin went out to law enforcement officers. A cop killer is on the loose. Even though he was sitting in a Texas movie house at this point, the description of the alleged cop killer matched Lee Oswald. That is, white shirt, white jacket, dark socks. Westbrook, without ever having entered the school book depository once he drove back there, immediately drives back to the Tippit murder scene in Oak Cliff. And once there, he reports finding a wallet with the ID of both Lee Harvey Oswald and a name that will come to know, Alex Heidel, which is a pseudonym used by Oswald. This discovery was captured by local TV news cameras. Westbrook orders the officers that are arriving at the scene to search the area. There could be evidence around here. And Westbrook alone drives a short distance away and plants the white jacket underneath a car in a parking area behind a service station. And this jacket is quickly discovered. And it too is captured by TV news cameras. Shortly after the all points bulletin, a suspicious person, somewhat matching the description of the cop killer, was reported entering the movie theater without having purchased a movie ticket, gol darn it. Police cars descended, but the first car to arrive and park directly in front of Texas Theater was none other than Captain Westbrook's unmarked car. Officers with guns drawn enter the 900-seat theater. House lights are turned on, revealing, as I said, 20 patrons. Starting at the front, officers go from person to person until they reach Oswald, who's seated at the near back end. He was the last person they got to. It's alleged that Oswald pulled his .38 revolver, but the inoperative weapon was never fired. It never could be fired. Oswald was cooperative through this until officers started beating him, and he began shouting, "I'm not resisting," police brutality. And here in this image, we see Captain Westbrook, along with another Dallas police officer, removing Oswald from Texas Theater. And guess what? Guess who was there to capture that moment? That's right, Stuart Reed. Another Kodak moment. Both the previous and this image right here just happened to be by the Texas Theater. Taken out by arresting officers through the front of the theater where a crowd had assembled. He was put into Westbrook's car, and note here, the first car to arrive. Reed, he had other things to do. So once he was filming, what his task was to do that day, went by the Dynacolor company to have the film processed, but because he had other things to do, he filled out an affidavit giving the Federal Bureau of Investigation permission to pick this film up and to use it in any manner that they saw fit, because he had to catch a plane that was going to take him to New Orleans, and from New Orleans, he was going to catch a vessel to the Canal Zone. Having served his purpose, he was out of town. In the midst of this, Lee Oswald, the person who allegedly did not buy a ticket, was escorted by police quietly from the balcony seating of the theater to a backstage area of the movie house and into a waiting police vehicle that was sitting there in the alley. Officers brought Harvey to the police headquarters, and while on the drive there, they found, guess what? A second wallet on him. Eventually, the first wallet will be lost. It'll just disappear from police custody. Ultimately, they'll find 4 wallets. All they needed was one, but they were trying to fix it so he'd be the guy, huh? The .38 revolver that Harvey possessed, in which they arrested him with, it would be exchanged for the .38 revolver that Lee had used on Tippit and had handed over to Westbrook. At police headquarters, Harvey Oswald was taken into an interview room where he was interviewed by the famed homicide detective Will Fritz with a 95% solve rate. No recording or note-taking of the interview occurred, however. And he's going to be in there for 12 hours. FBI also came in and was interviewing him. Again, no record is kept. But within an hour of his arrest, police began to announce that they had apprehended a suspect in the assassination. But it would be more than 12 hours before they told him about it and that he was officially charged. When he was in there and he figured out this is not going well, he kept asking for an attorney and they kept saying, say what? Speculation that circulated in the media that the president had been assassinated through a conspiracy originating in Havana, but this conspiracy, really the first conspiracy, had been planned and fostered by the CIA months, if not years in advance. The aim was to create a pretext for US military attack on Cuba. They wanted to finish the business of Operation Zapata. And even though Kennedy had turned him down, they were going to use Kennedy's murder as the pretext. While in Air Force One at Love Field, news of Oswald's arrest broke, along with the Cuban conspiracy speculation. That was happening very quickly. LBJ began making calls to his henchmen and Dallas authorities. You have your man, there's no conspiracy, stop the investigation, over and over again. You know, Will Fritz wanted to finish this thing up, but LBJ shut it down. There was and never has been a homicide investigation of the murder of John F. Kennedy. Though it would take more days to do so, LBJ effectively would shut down the investigation, and the CIA's conspiracy pretext for an attack on Cuba will just fade away to some extent, except for those people that continue to believe it. Hoover informed LBJ that CIA's photographs and voice recordings of a double Oswald in Mexico City during September were, in light of the real Oswald under arrest and speaking to news camera, too obviously fake. So they had this imposter down there trying to pretend and really make out like I'm a commie, want to get into Cuba. They couldn't use it. So they had to let it all go. But those guys down there in Mexico City, they were sure trying to make it work. They wouldn't let it go. However, while on the one hand, LBJ worked to stifle the CIA's Cuban conspiracy claim, on the other hand, he used the potential threat of nuclear war to achieve other aims, namely to have various people do his bidding unquestioningly during this uncertain time. You know, that's how he got Earl Warren. Earl, he said, Chief Justice, if you don't take this job, you know, we could have, and the American people feel that this is a conspiracy from Cuba or from Moscow, we could have the threat of nuclear war. But do you want the blood of 40 million people on your hands? And he, you know, allegedly brought Earl Warren to tears. And with that, Warren said, okay, I'll take the job. When he left the office, LBJ turned to his cronies and had a good laugh. I brought Chief Justice to tears. Meanwhile, and this is where we'll conclude, because I'm sure you're asking this question, that same day, Lee Oswald was flown out of Dallas on a military plane and delivered to Walker Air Force Base in Roswell, New Mexico, and that is the last trace that we have of him. I'm sure he entered the witness protection program or whatever version they had of it, but that's how he got out of Dallas. So that is the successful cover-up at that time. So let me come out of here and see what's on your mind. I know it's a lot.
This is Kathy.
Kathy?
I just don't understand all the convolution with Lee and Harvey and all that. I mean, why did you need to have all of that going on?
Gloss.
It just seemed, ugh, just one person, anyway, it just seems like a lot of hoopla for nothing.
Well, they needed to make the Patsy story stick, and just having the one Lee there or the Harvey there, they didn't feel that it was going to get done. So they needed Lee helping out. That's why Lee is involved with the shooting. They didn't, these people were not going to, the police department was struggling to just figure out what was going on with the presidential assassination. But just mention to them, oh, we've got a cop killer. Boy, that was motivation. Then they were ready to do their work.
Right.
And so they knew in advance we needed to get the blood up on these cops. And they did that by having, the murder of one of their own. That was carried out by the Lee Oswald. He's the one that did that, but you saw how closely connected he was to Westbrook and to Officer Croy. I think what was going to happen, they wanted to get, when you have a situation like this, you try to get your Patsy killed as quickly as possible so it answers all the questions, or nobody's going to raise questions. I think they wanted to get him in the Texas School Book Depository. He got out of there and he got on a bus. They tried to follow him on the bus. They were going to get him on the bus. He eluded them on the bus. He's on the taxi back home, and they're figuring that he's going to be going to where contact had been established in advance to go to Texas Theater. And they anticipated killing him in the Texas Theater. But for whatever reason, there's something like 40 officers that arrive at the Texas Theater, for this guy that didn't pay for a movie ticket. And of course, they think they're coming in there to get a cop killer, and it didn't come off. So they had to get him out, and they took him into custody into the police department. And now they've got a problem. This guy is talking. He's talking, and he's letting him know. Of course, they're not recording it, but they cannot let him get in front of the cameras. I mean, he occasionally, when they move him from one room to another, the cameras are there, and he's speaking to them. But they have arranged to have a major press conference for the international press as well as domestic on Sunday. But that's going to be at the county jail. So that's why they're moving him from city jail to county jail. And Jack Ruby is at the city jail, and his assignment is to kill Oswald. He has carte blanche, without going into too much about Jack Ruby, he has carte blanche moving through the police headquarters. And he's there Friday afternoon, he's there all day Saturday, and he gets close to Oswald, but not close enough. So he's back there on Sunday, and when they make that move from his cell across the parking area there in the basement, Oswald just pops out. And it's thought by some that it is Sergeant Croy who gave him access to the basement right there. Well, that's how we got there.
Oh, this is Penny. What would have been, why would Oswald have gone to the trouble of killing Tibbetts? I mean, why would he have, what would have been his reasoning for that? I mean, his reasoning, not the plot's reasoning.
He's just, Penny, he's just following orders. He's just following orders.
Oh.
They need a cop killed, and Tibbet is the sacrificial lamb. And so they're using Lee Oswald in conjunction with Westbrook and Croy to do the killing. And then they leave the scene, and then Westbrook comes back and he plants incriminating evidence that's going to lead to Harvey Oswald. But they need a cop killer. And that's why they went after the Harvey Oswald in Texas Theater. He's lucky he got out of there alive. They expected.
I mean, so this guy, I mean, Oswald, he kills the president, then he goes home, and then he just shoots a policeman just for the heck of it.
Well, Harvey Oswald didn't shoot anybody that day. He didn't fire a gun. He's made set up to look like he did it. And it's the Lee Oswald who is, making the presence of Harvey Oswald seem apparent at the 6th floor window when Harvey Oswald is really down on the 2nd floor eating his lunch.
Right.
And then Lee Oswald is out the back of the building, and he's on to the second half of his day, which is to participate in this killing of Tippett. on the other side of town.
Hey, John,
not
I got
sure.
a few questions.
Okay, go ahead, Butch.
You know, this is just an aside, but if you go back several of your frames of the presentation, that bus 1213
Mhm.
has not yet reached the school depository. It's pointed toward the school depository.
Right, right.
But what you said was Harvey Oswald came out of the building, got on the bus, went away from the building, and then the bus stalled and he took a taxi.
Right.
But in the picture there, the bus hasn't even gotten to the school book depository yet. That's one thing. So you can
Right.
go back and review that.
But I'm aware. What he does, is
but-
he let me, if I can answer that, but what he does, he comes out of the entrance of it and he walks down Elm Street where the bus stop was at, and he gets on there, and the bus is intending to take him right past where he just left and take him under the triple underpass to a direction
Okay.
moving to the west.
Okay, I got it. So both of the Oswalds were there, and neither of them shot the president, but Lee shot Tippett so they could have a cop killer to go after and take the investigation another way.
Correct.
So I got that. Summing it all up from everything you've read, and you may have said this somewhere in the program, but I just am not getting it. How many weapons were fired? Who do you think fired them? And from where were they fired?
Well, that's a question that we're never going to be certain about, Butch. But I'll refer back to someone who is more knowledgeable about sniping is this Brian Edwards. I'm not sure that there were as many. He elicits that there's as many as 4 firing teams. The source that I'm using for this course here, Philip Nelson, the compilation that he has, he's looking at 3 firing teams, one of which is in the school book depository, likely they're up on the roof and at the far end, the opposite end of the 6th floor window. A second team is on the grassy knoll in 2 separate positions behind the fence. And a third team is in a combination of the Dow Tex building and the county records building. Now, Brian Edwards posits that there is a 4th team that is on the triple overpass on the opposite side of where the traffic is going under, and it's having a direct
On the trestle?
On the trestle right there, yeah. But he posits that, and rather than for me to tell his argument for that, go and listen to. I mean, I know it's lengthy, where you can cut right to that portion of his talk right there, where he identifies where he thinks the sniper teams were at, and he posits that there is one there as also.
And the number of rounds fired?
I would say it's anybody that I'm figuring from my estimation of just how many hit that we are aware of is approximately 10. I dare say there were more. And what we have the first one that shot way over the vehicle, that landed on the concrete by the triple overpass, and a piece of concrete split up and it hit James Tegg in the neck. That's number 1. Second one hits JFK in the back. That's when it brings up this involuntary reaction, gets him to rise up in the vehicle. Third shot comes through the windshield, hits JFK in the throat. Fourth shot hits Connolly. 5th shot, 6th shot, one hits the metal strip over the leading edge of the
Windshield.
with a presidential vehicle right there. Another one overshoots and lands in the grass. And then we have the devastating shots that hit the president. One lands just below his hairline here, but as I say, it's a solid bullet. It's not a frangible bullet. So it traverses and probably stays within his skull, doesn't exit. Immediately upon that bullet, a second bullet hits right here at his right temple. And this one is a frangible bullet, meaning when it hits, it blows into pieces. That's the one that shatters and blows out the rear portion of his brain here. Now, Roy Kellerman has posited, as he said, we were hit, he said that there was lead coming into this limousine from all directions. And when they did clean out the limousine at Parkland, they were finding all kinds of bullet fragments. Of course, Sam Kinney says, I found a full bullet. The recent Paul Landis says, I found a full bullet. Who knows? I don't take their stories to be believable. I think we find a lot of fragments of bullets within the vehicle when they started cleaning it up, and those were presented later, but not. First of all, that vehicle never should have been touched. That vehicle should have been taken into evidence right there and put in the back of that vehicle, and FBI should have been all over it. But instead, LBJ ordered it be cleaned out. And so the two most important pieces of evidence were the president's body and that vehicle. And both of those were interfered with by the order of LBJ.
Yeah. Well, it bothers me that a lot of things, but that the information won't be released because it's more than the American people could take or something like that.
For the good
I don't buy that.
For the good of the country.
That's just wrong. I mean, that's just wrong. I mean, what would Woodward and Bernstein say about that, right? They say go for the truth and let the cards fall where they may.
Go
ahead, Margaret.
I have a problem exactly with what you just said. How is it possible that I know the 60s were different as far as reporting, but how could there not have been investigative reporters who looked into this and didn't write about it and talk about it? I mean, why is it 40 years later or 30 years later that it started? I mean, did they just shoot all the reporters that were investigating so they couldn't?
Margaret, let me address that, because it actually, one of the things that happened was there's actually a third important piece of evidence, and that is the film that was shot by Abraham Zapruder. But one of the things, not everybody holds with this, but I hold with it, that Abraham Zapruder's film was taken into possession by Secret Service on the afternoon of December 22nd. And they viewed it and they saw the problems that they had there. One of the biggest problems that they have is that William Greer brings the presidential vehicle to a full stop. And it's in that full stop that the president gets shot. So they had to alter the film, and they cut X number of frames from that film, spliced it back together, sent it back to Abraham Zapruder, and that's what he sells to Life magazine the following day. And that enters into the public awareness of what happened here. When they have that, they allow one local reporter to come in and view that Abraham Zapruder shot right there, and it's Dan Rather, who's a reporter in Texas. And he said, I witnessed this, and I saw the president's head struck from behind and move violently forward. So it's like if this guy saw it and said that, then it must be so. But in fact, and a lot of people then have come back to Dan Rather and say, how could you ever have said that? But what Dan Rather may have been witnessing in that private screening is the altered Zapruder film. Now, since then, that film has been kind of rejiggered again, but they've never put back in that extended footage. Some have estimated, David Lifton, who I mentioned a little while ago, he estimates that it could be as many as 200 frames from it. I don't think it's quite that long, but it's a substantial portion of the film that's been removed, and then the film further has been altered. And that's, so it will never really, what we're looking at and thinking what we're seeing it there isn't really so. So reporters at the time was, you know, if Dan Rather and these others have seen it, they're telling us that, why go further? And it's only in the in 1965 and 66 that these other first responders that I've mentioned, that they begin to dig in it, and they on their own time and their own dime go out and interview people there and find out it's a whole different scene. Mark Lane, you know, he went out and on camera interviewed people that said the shooting came from right over there in the grassy knoll, and we went chasing after it. None of that was used at the time. And then all they had to work with was the volumes of the Warren Commission report. And when they got into that, they said, oh, what a mess this is. And they used the Warren Commission to tear apart the executive summary. So that's in part. And it's so reporters, it would be reporters coming, not reporters, but investigators, researchers, people like you and me that said, I just don't believe this, and I'm going to spend my time looking into it.
Okay, but the reporters had to have had forensic people on staff or something where they could look at the film and you can see that it stopped at a point. And then why didn't they say that right away? Wait a minute, this film, even though Dan Rather saw it, as soon as it became public knowledge, you know, the public saw it, which was pretty quick.
Yeah. Well, the public
why didn't somebody say that?
Well, because with a few exceptions, the public did not see the film until 12 years later, 1975. Now, a few people in the film and video community, they were seeing it privately. David Lifton, who I mentioned a moment ago, he became very focused on what he saw as the alteration of the film. And he kept searching for a better and better copy of it, because it was blown up from a 8mm into a 16mm and then into a 35mm. So he could have a really good picture there. And when he got to that, he witnessed and he said, oh my God, what are those blobs on the back of the president's head? Someone went in and did, remember I mentioned last week using opaquing? They did it to the Pruder film as well. They opaqued the back of the president's head with black so that you couldn't see the open wound back there, and this became visible. Douglas Horn, who I mentioned also on your source list, he goes right at this as well. I mean, the real thing here is we can see the level of the conspiracy. It was so deep and wide, you know, and it was hard to get at the truth. You had to fight for the truth, and the people that were protecting it were not going to let it come easy. And it was these few researchers and it took them years to get at this material. And here we are 60 years later, you know, and I'm just being able to share this with you now. And this should have been out here decades ago. And it's only if you follow within the research community that these people have been talking about it among themselves, trying to get attention drawn to it. But we continue to get so much pushback from the CIA. I contend that this Paul Landis book is a limited hangout. Okay, there was a conspiracy, there was a bullet that came through, hit the president here, but that's it. And we didn't have anything to do with it. And that's all pushback from the CIA trying to move the needle back over here to the American people will say, well, it could have been so. And what I'm presenting to you here over the course of these 6 weeks is that, and there is so much information that just reveals what has happened. As I said at the beginning, I think we can see the truth. There's still a glass darkly between us and the truth, but we have a pretty good idea of what's on the other side there right now, if we choose to see it.
Is there any effort underway that you know of to force the release of those remaining 4,000 documents?
No, that I don't, as I mentioned earlier, it was the incumbent on President Trump to do it by 2017. He said, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. And then he got a visit from CIA, and he said, hey, if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't do it either. So he kicked the can down to President Biden. Biden says, hey, we've got this thing called COVID. This is no time to be releasing information about Kennedy's assassination. I'll do it later. And then on July 4th of this year, Biden signed an executive order that said, we no longer have to abide by the JFK Act. These agencies don't have to release anything more. So it's up to nonprofit agencies that are trying to get at this material to wage a court battle against the current administration to get the release of these documents. And we don't have a resolution to that now, Butch.
John, I have a question for you, John.
Go ahead.
The thing that one of the things that's always a mystery for me was that Johnson, he went through his term as he was elected president.
Mhm.
And there was some talk that he could have won a second term handedly, but the war was going on in Vietnam and everything. So he didn't run for his second term,
Mhm.
but he died 5 years later, basically 9 years after the assassination. So could that have been, they said he died of a heart attack, but what do you think?
Well, I think Johnson was very concerned. He had this. That's why Johnson was pressing so hard to get on the ticket in 1960, because he knew that he did not. I think he knew that he did not have long to live. His father died in his 60s. He'd had this massive heart attack before, and he was living on borrowed time. So he had to get in. He was in that first 3 years of Kennedy's administration. He said, this guy's never going to die, and I'm going to go to prison. I'm never going to fulfill what I want. And once he had fulfilled his first full administration and was looking at what might come in his foot, and I just think he couldn't bear, I don't think he could live with himself. And, he went back on the ranch, he drank himself to death, and he died of a coronary issue. You've probably seen those photographs of him. He went wild. He grew his hair long, and he went Howard Hughes on us.
Yeah.
Driving around on his ranch, shooting at animals and drinking cuddy all day.
Yeah, I think it was a heavy weight on him, I think.
Yeah.
Man, do that kind.
Well, the other part about what Butch was talking about, what's the push? Is there any push to get these papers or files open again? There are so many people involved in that, and it just, in the whole thing, it would be so destructive to so many people that to try to get this brought out and open would be an amazing feat against with all the powers that are involved in this.
Okay,
Are we a free society or are we not?
Amen, brother.
No.
Amen.
Yeah, and
You know what?
I'm
I'm
Go
not
ahead.
sure anybody would believe it, no matter what the actual evidence came out anymore. It would depend on who brought it out, when and where. Otherwise, nobody believes anything that the government says, so it probably wouldn't even matter.
But to a large degree, the information is out there. I mean, as I said, there's so much out there, it becomes mind-boggling, which is at the beginning, I said, it's a 100,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. I've swept up 99,000 pieces off the table onto the floor to just look at these few here, to try to put together a picture that we can hold together to say, this is reasonable. Johnson had motive and means to do this. And, I think, as I said last week, where him ducking down on the floorboards of that vehicle is all the proof I think we need to see. He knew what was coming. He got Kennedy back there. He laid all the groundwork for it. He laid his heart open to Madeline Brown. They're never going to get me again. And
Never embarrass me again.
And he had his own reasons, but as I said, there's a list of people that wanted Kennedy dead. Both in the military and the CIA in particular, and in the business. The moneyed class in this country wanted Kennedy gone. They were all happy. And that's why I said, I made this remark about that high school in Arkansas, that high school class in Arkansas rose up and cheered. There was a CIA station in Japan, at Atsugi Station in Japan, they all got up and cheered, "Hey, we're having a party, Kennedy's dead." And so it not everybody was remorseful and saddened by what had happened here. It was a brand new day. Well, everybody, I like I said, I'm taking you down a dark river. You have to tell you something here, Al.
Yeah.
When I do this class in person, when I do these last couple of classes here, I bring in a bar of dark chocolate, 85, 78% chocolate. I pass out. Take a piece of this chocolate, baby, because you need some good medicine to help swallow all this dark material that I'm going to be delivering. And it helped, but I can't reach out and say have some dark chocolate, but whatever's at hand to get you through. I appreciate very much you being with me. I appreciate very much Sandra and the team at the University of Arkansas to bring this really provocative subject to you. And it's really, as I said, I'm bringing the work of others. I'm the messenger. It's been out there 10, 20 years, but for various reasons, mass media, major media will not talk about it. But we have.
Thank you so much, John. It's been great.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. Of course, it'll be recorded, and if you have an opportunity to review it, if I can think of something to throw in for the show notes to include with this, I will, and they'll be included. I hope to see you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And on that, I'm going to have a glass of Cuddy.
I'm waiting for my chocolate bar.
Well, it's wavered
Wait.
between very interesting, gripping, unsettling, depressing, and totally informative. So thank you very much.
Yes,
Very
thank you,
well-
John.
Very well said.
Thank you.
Right.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you, John.
Okay.
Happy
Thank you.
holidays.
Yeah, happy
You as well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.